Hi, welcome to another episode of Meet the Author. Today, I have the author of the book, Handwriting Can Make Sense by Kate Gladstone. Welcome, Kate, to our show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Jason.
Kate is a handwriting instruction, remediation, and evaluation consultant. Her company is Handwriting That Works. She's also director of the World Handwriting Contest. That's interesting. And a co-designer of the app Better Letters, the personal handwriting trainer for the iPhone, iPod Touch, and iPad, and holder of a U.S. patent for signature verification for pen-based computers. Very nice.
That's right. More recently, another app of mine is an app called Read Cursive, which will train anyone to do exactly that, whether or not he or she can write cursive.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
So, Kate, tell us a little bit about how you got into the field of handwriting and became the person who runs the World Handwriting Contest.
I got into the field of handwriting instruction, improvement, and so on because of my lifelong struggles until I was 24 with my then very bad handwriting. I was just notoriously the handwriting washout of the school, the worst anyone had ever seen. I hit bottom scribally when I was 24 going through graduate school, and I had to do a lot of writing as this was graduate school for library science, and also I often was at home having to take messages if my parents' answering machine didn't work. Fortunately, having access to graduate level libraries in New York City and the surrounding area allowed me to do some explorations of my own, and I decided literally to look at all the handwriting material that ever had been published insofar as it lay in me to find it, try everything, see what worked, and throw out what didn't.
So you basically taught yourself how to improve your handwriting,
Yes.
or you had an instructor?
I retaught myself, although part of this was with correspondence with other people who were either doing the same or often with the authors of the book. Very often, the authors of the various books would have their names and addresses in the book along with samples of their own handwriting. Very often they showed the handwriting of successful students, and I think I wrote to them all at one stage or another. This was way before the internet. You know, I am 52, and this was back when I was 24, and you remember how hard it was to track people down in BC, before cyberspace.
Right.
So I would not only look for handwriting books, I ended up looking for phone books and trying to find addresses that way, and very often I did.
Okay.
And I wrote to them by hand, of course.
So you're able to correct your handwriting, but what made you get into the field now of correcting other people's handwriting?
That was because of my father, a handwriting washout like me. When he saw my handwriting improved, he asked for some help.
Oh, really?
I gave him a few lessons, and he thought at first, well, this was interesting. But when he began to improve appreciably, he said, you ought to take this nationwide and worldwide. You ought to advertise to doctors. And it so happened that my first paying clientele was a group of hospital doctors in a hospital in upstate New York that had responded to my very first ad, which was directed to the medical profession on the internet, which was still very new, literally looking for people whose handwriting I could fix.
For some reason, doctors are known to have notoriously poor handwriting, or maybe it's on purpose, but...
It's seldom on purpose. Most of the ones that I've seen have tried to improve and have not wanted to be hard.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I always thought they had a special squibbly form because they didn't want people to be able to read the prescriptions, only the druggist. Is that true, or they just had poor handwriting?
They do have, on top of the poor handwriting, they have traditionally had various secret codes and symbols and abbreviations, which are more for the purpose of speed, like a sort of shorthand, than to hide anything. However, insofar as handwriting records still remain, a lot of it is fortunately going to e-prescribing. what was happening, coincidentally, at about the same time I was getting into the handwriting business, was that the various doctor and hospital accreditation organizations had started to crusade against the abbreviations, and they wanted everything written out in full. They wanted everything written out in full because of the risk of medical error. Some of these abbreviations are very confusable.
And now pretty soon they're going to have to write everything by computer.
True, except that a lot of the computer systems for MDs and others turn out to involve handwriting after all. If you go onto the App Store of almost any tablet platform and you look for a notebook program or a text composition program, about half of the ones that come out will ask you to use your stylus or a finger, or will have that as a major input method.
Well, I'm sure our audience who's listening can already grasp from Kate that she's an expert in handwriting. She goes and does research about handwriting, and it's just amazing. You know, this is somebody who loves the whole field, not just correcting handwriting itself. I asked you before the show, because you have such a wealth of knowledge about handwriting, is there a handwriting museum?
Yes, there actually is, or was the last time I checked a few years ago. It's in St. Ambrose University, Davenport, Iowa, and is run in conjunction with their calligraphy major, because their calligraphy major starts by remediating the handwriting of every student.
And what type of things would be in a handwriting museum?
Well, documents, for instance, of some of the earliest known forms of handwriting from different ancient cultures, examples of the writing tools that have been used throughout the millennia. Many of us are familiar with quill pens, but before that, there were reeds, literally sharpened sticks or pieces of grass cut to shape. Other items that you might find in a handwriting museum would include reproductions of famous handwritten documents, or sometimes the originals. A great focus of this museum, I understand, I've never had the opportunity to visit, but I know it's there, is documenting the changing methods of teaching and practicing handwriting that have existed down the years.
Well, that's interesting you mentioned that, because you know, although that's not really the topic today, you know about that great debate today, should we teach cursive handwriting in school? So, and that would have to do with the changing of handwriting over time, or not even teaching handwriting anymore. What do you have to say about that? I know you're very active in this debate. What do you have to say about that?
I have to say that we all need to read cursive, because cursive is out there. Fortunately, you can and probably should learn to read a handwriting style without necessarily having to write it yourself. Here is figure 2. If we had to learn to read handwriting, and if we could only read what we actually wrote, we would be in trouble every time we read our morning newspaper, because the lowercase a and g in most type fonts are forms that are no longer normally written and haven't been for several centuries. In fact, for several centuries. If we could not learn how to read any script that we didn't know how to write, would we all be able to learn to read important historical documents such as the Declaration of the Independence of the United States of America? You know, and we think of that, oh, cursive, this is the reason we must learn to read cursive.
So that's a good point, because I read that students today actually can't read handwriting. Someone else's handwriting.
Because they're not exposed to it and they're not trained. The fortunate thing is that if we had to learn to write cursive or anything else in order to learn to read it, we wouldn't be able to read parts of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, because look at America. This is a reproduction of a word from the document. Nobody writes an A like that. Nobody has written an A like that except for purposes of highly formal calligraphy for quite some time now.
That brings up a good question. How do certain letters, and it, you know,
by the way,
we have a
figure
lot of
2. Yeah.
We have a lot of letters that we do not see today. How do they lose? How do they become like unpopular and they're no longer used? What happens to them?
They become unpopular because people think of different, perhaps simpler ways of doing things. Or sometimes people unfortunately think of more complicated ways of doing things, which is how we got conventional cursive. Figure 1 here, for instance.
We'll take that off so people can see.
Figure 1 here, for instance, we have a matter which has perplexed people often. How did it happen that this is a letter Q, and that 2 years later, when you're in 3rd grade, this is also a letter Q? Going from the left to the right, there is actually a sequence. An originally simple letter Q, which in its basic shape goes back to the Romans, and the roots of it go back even earlier, eventually was modified by someone figuring it might be quicker to start at the bottom of the letter. Once they started at the bottom, the next person in line apparently didn't want to go all the way to the bottom to start and left a little gap. Continue this, put in some curlicues because you want to impress the paying public if you're a teacher, and you end up with that fancy 2 shape that passes as a Q in most conventional cursive methods.
Very interesting. That's almost like the famous joke telephone line where everybody who listens to the conversation changes it a little bit. And so that's very interesting you bring that up, that is happening, which also means handwriting wasn't totally set in stone, but it could evolve and change. And just look how many fonts there are. So
yes.
Let me ask you now, when we came in here, and this is Wethersfield, a very historical town, and we came in and we saw the Declaration of Independence, and we saw John Hancock's signature. That was the Declaration of Independence, correct? And he was known, you know, put your John Hancock here. He was known to have one of the best handwritings in the world.
Indeed.
So tell me a little bit about his handwriting, and you were telling me about that he had an instructor, and how did he become so famous that people say, put your John Hancock here?
Well, John Hancock, once he was able to begin making his way in the world, which actually began when he was orphaned and his aunt and uncle gave him a better education than his parents had been able to give, he actually had a handwriting instructor, a writing master as they were called, stop by his house every week when he was a child, and like many people of his age, he continued the practice when he was grown. And it was much like going to a personal trainer today, except for handwriting instead of exercise. The man would come, the man would actually look at what he'd done, assign more homework, consult with him on any special problems, make another appointment, very much what we do. In fact, we even know the name of John Hancock's personal handwriting trainer. He was a man called Abiah Holbrook, Abiah Holbrook, and he actually had written one of the more popular handwriting books of the day, a very elaborate conventional cursive book which remained in print for decades.
And you also mentioned that you had a picture, or you'll talk about it later, but you mentioned the very first handwriting book out there. What year was that in?
That was in 1522 in Rome, Italy. Actually, would you like to see a copy of this?
Sure. Which, you have that?
Let's see. We certainly
that would
do.
Be number 5.
And this would be number 5 is our picture.
So
Thank
you. See it. There you go.
I hope he can cut judiciously. Well, number 5, and we have here, we can see how handwriting, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, handwriting, at the time that people first began to codify it in instructional manuals, was much simpler than we have normally decided to inflict on students in penmanship courses. If you look at it, we see a very fluent, very streamlined, what today would be called semi-printing.
And you said that we can get this today on the internet?
Yes, actually, this particular item has actually been reprinted and more recently has been translated into English. The original language was Italian, and put onto the internet. I will actually be sending you a link afterwards, and those who are curious can then get it from you if they want to download their very own copy of the first ever handwriting book. And this is one of the books that made a difference in my life, by the way.
What did your book, Handwriting Can Make Sense add to that person's book from, what would you say, the 1500s again?
Yes,
what has changed since then that you had to write a book now?
I have to contend with a lot more. I have to prove that handwriting remains important, which is one area I discuss. I have to deal with the fact that people who come to me have usually been through the mill as far as handwriting goes. They have usually had at least one printing method and at least one cursive method, which usually have been diametrically opposite, which usually have been very difficult, which usually have been mutually contradictory. These may be people who, far from simply not being very instructed about handwriting, have been drowning in instruction, have been drowning in a welter of letter forms. Remember that, as you said, in our civilization, there are numerous fonts and other letter styles. There are at least 1 million fonts out there, and that's just fonts, not even counting individual handwritings. Now, I don't want to eliminate one speck of that diversity. Diversity is fun, but we have to be able to read it. We have to be able to swim in the sea rather than drown in the sea of scribally variant styles.
Okay, so now we talked about one of the best handwritings from John Hancock. Now we're going to show an example. This is number 6.
Yes.
You can show that and then let people guess maybe before you give the name whose handwriting that might be.
Whose handwriting might that be? I will reassure you that despite appearances, it uses the same alphabet we use in English, although the writer was not writing in English. Now, anyone who is watching this and who recognizes the writer wins a free lesson from me. And anyway, anyone who can read it wins 2 free lessons.
Okay, so who is the writer?
This is Thomas Aquinas, a very well-known writer and thinker of the 13th century. His name will be familiar to most people who did not fall asleep in medieval history class. He is of some interest to me because every so often I hear from teachers or parents who really believe that if you don't write clearly, you're nothing, and if you don't have beautiful handwriting, you probably don't have a functioning brain in your head. Let's just say that this fellow is generally conceded to have had a functioning brain, and that one of the people who approached me and said, why don't you make people aware that if you have horrible handwriting, you're a horrible thinker and a horrible person, happened to be teaching in a school named after him. I wrote her back, pointing out that fact and enclosing the graphic that I showed, and I never heard from her again.
So you mentioned that you said it on television, that you're going to give a free course to somebody, or a free couple lessons.
A free lesson to anyone
who had known that.
Who knew that before I said so.
We already said.
I will trust you.
So that is a question now.
If they can read what it says, they get 2 free lessons.
That's cute. So do they have to go all the way to Albany, New York, or they
can send me an email. If they send me an email and if it mentions the name.
No, I'm talking about the lesson.
We do that I do that very often by FaceTime these days.
What do you mean by FaceTime?
I actually have FaceTime on my iPad and my iPhone.
Oh, that's like Skype?
It's basically like Skype, only it's for iPad and iPhones.
Oh, I learned something new today. I didn't know what FaceTime was.
And I like FaceTime better.
What is FaceTime?
It's like Skype, except you don't have to pay, and mechanically it works a little more smoothly. I've given up using Skype because it always crashed on me. FaceTime works beautifully, and anyone who can make a phone call can do it, can have video. My 2 most recent FaceTime students are one in Canada and one in Egypt, actually.
Cool. Wow. So,
or people can come and see me.
Which is your next picture?
I would say.
Did you want to do this one?
I would say this one. I would like to point out, we can go to.
What number was that?
The number was removed, so maybe we better skip that one.
Well, you can hold it up.
Well, I'll hold this up. This one is one that I like to show because this is another famous author's handwriting, actually from the heyday of conventional cursive, Francis Scott Key, and this is his initial draft, his first written copy of the Star-Spangled Banner.
Oh, wow.
I like to show this to show people that even in the day when conventional cursive reigned supreme, joining every letter and looping and ornamenting most of them, We had individual writers who deviated often to their advantage. Look at the enlargement of the word star-spangled. Notice that the S and R are printed in form. Notice that the T was apparently crossed when it was made rather than wait to the end of the word because there is a space after it. Believe it or not, there's a speed advantage to doing so. You don't have to drag your hand through the whole rest of the word and then go back to cross the T or dot the I or whatever. Unlike what you were taught in class, it actually is faster to finish every letter before you begin the next. And look at the lowercase y in key. Not a trace of a loop, but it's legibly beautiful and beautifully legible.
So now this is number 7.
Yes.
Okay, you can hold that one up.
This is what I like to call my Mythbuster Fact. This is a fact that you will never be told in 3rd grade or 2nd grade or whenever you learned cursive. You're often told, oh, you have to write cursive because you need a legal signature and that's the only way to get one. And without a legal signature, you know, you won't be able to do all the grown-up things like vote or, you know, have a job or all that. Well, it's not true. And here is a legal statement to prove it. And yes, I have this courtesy of legal research that I asked for. I won't go into the legal fine print except to summarize in plain English, your signature is whatever you produce when you intend to produce your signature.
Well, I mean, we know that people used to sign an X, you say in all the old movies, put your X right here. So, does that go along with what you're saying?
Well, X's actually can be identified by questioned
or
document
put your mark
examiners.
Over here and it would be an X.
Although it's better to have more than just an X, but even an X can be individual. In fact, think of kindergarten and 1st grade teachers when they're dealing with children who are just beginning to write, often in print. Any 1st grade or kindergarten teacher can look at an unsigned piece of work from a student in his or her class and can tell you who wrote that, even though it's printed and not signed, because any handwriting, whether or not the letters are joined, the handwriting is individual. We cannot stamp out our individuality if we try, no matter what the method.
Now we're going to see this funny photo, number 8. We're going to talk about that. Why that?
Why the chicken?
Doesn't look like handwriting to me.
No, this isn't handwriting. Beyond the obvious reference to chicken scratch, this was my mental reaction whenever I was young, and I would have questions about handwriting as in, why doesn't mine work? Why are cursive R's and lowercase r's and uppercase Q's so weird? Why is the cursive G in my name so weird? Why do doctors write and it doesn't even look like writing? And how did handwriting get to be in the state it's in? And the only answer I was ever given was, when you are older, you'll understand. The picture gives my thoughts on this.
So what is the thought?
You see, this is a chicken talking to a fried egg. She's telling this fried egg that someday it will understand. What prospect is there of it ever understanding?
Oh, okay. Okay.
Thank you.
That actually, because you brought up the chicken, that brings up my own history with poor handwriting. I had poor handwriting until the age of 40. And when I was in college, 1 year before the word processor came out, I was in Johns Hopkins College in an English composition class, and I wrote a composition by hand, gave it to the instructor. He held up all the papers and passed it out to the class, and then when he got to one paper, I was still waiting for mine, he says, this is a B, but it looks like someone spilled some ink and a chicken walked all over it. That's the chicken squirrel. I had never heard that before, but then he gave me the paper and I never was so embarrassed because I knew I had poor handwriting. I actually wrote in 2 languages, Hebrew and English, and my Hebrew language was actually quite good, but my English was not. We know that Hebrew and English go in different directions. And I was so embarrassed, and one day I wanted to fix my handwriting, which I did. And by the time I got to age that was about age 25. When I got to age 40, when my handwriting was poor, I decided I was going to do something about it. I fixed my handwriting, and eventually the knowledge I obtained to fix my handwriting, I put in a video called Anyone Can Improve Their Handwriting, which I later made a second version, Anyone Can Improve Their Own Handwriting, and that could be downloaded on Amazon.com. And I realized when I put it out, after I did a search to the best of my knowledge, it was actually the very first video in handwriting correction ever. And it all started because the professor told me I had chicken scrawl. So I knew that even though I was a scientist and had won awards and everything, I knew that your handwriting does reflect your mentality. You feel like something's wrong with me if my handwriting is poor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, we often have that feeling just because anyone wants to do well. It's something he or she does, but it's often aggravated for us by teachers or even fellow students or colleagues picking on us. It is a shame to pick on people for poor handwriting because very, very often, I'd say amazingly often, it can be brought to a state of excellence or at the very least to a state of solid competence. For what it's worth, if it's any consolation, the comparison of bad handwriting to chicken scratch actually goes back in literature at least 2,000 years.
2,000 years.
Because its earliest appearance, as far as I know, was in the work of a Roman playwright called Plautus, Plautus. In one of his plays, two characters are looking at a letter which is extremely hard to read, and one of them says to the other, "Chickens must have hands because this looks like a chicken wrote this."
Wow. Because, I mean, who would ever think of it looks like chicken scrawl? I mean, who cares? Chickens are not going to paint or draw, so that makes sense now. Mm-hmm. I must say also that I had, when I developed my own video, which you had seen, and in a moment you'll talk about that too, I had actually put out a book before I put out the video on handwriting on how to improve your art, because I also couldn't draw, although I can put out beautiful impressionistic type paintings, and today one of the things I do is instruct art. So I put out the very first book to teach children how to think and see like an artist. It was called Creative Painting for the Young Artist. And one of the techniques I used in my video to improve handwriting, actually handwriting correction, it's not teaching handwriting, was thinking and seeing like an artist, which you had said that's a very well-known, one of the ways to help people actually improve their handwriting. There are many reasons why someone's handwriting's not nice, and maybe you can describe or talk about why people have a poor handwriting. What have you seen in your clinic, and what does thinking and seeing like an artist have to do with that?
Well, one reason for poor handwriting, as I've mentioned, is self-contradictory instruction, which is all too common in the USA. Another reason is neglected instruction. In other words, if you don't teach handwriting, if all you do is maybe show a person a chart of how the letters should look, but you don't teach handwriting, you cannot expect good results any more than you'd expect to teach someone how to be a skier by showing him films of someone skiing. We also have, of course, issues of the immense variation in personal ability, some of which is inborn, some of which may be the result of accidents or medical conditions. It often happens that a person is not or not yet receptive to instruction at the time that it is given, and that person may be literally written off.
So I want to break in over here for a second. I'm happy you mentioned that because I work with kids who have ADHD, and for many years, and I would get through them also they would have, some of them would have poor handwriting, and they would go to occupational therapists because they were told that they have poor shoulder girdle strength, and they would go for a whole year and their handwriting didn't seem to be improved. I'm not saying that they don't have poor shoulder strength, but then I would be able to correct their handwriting quite quickly. Can you mention about that? Is that really a true reason to have poor handwriting?
Well, it can be. Muscular weakness can weaken your handwriting because handwriting is a manual skill. It's something you do with your hand, normally with your hands and arms. However, shoulder girdle strength or some of the other factors that OTs mentioned are neither sufficient nor absolutely necessary conditions for handwriting. I have abominable shoulder girdle strength, but I make my living teaching and remediating handwriting. You've seen mine. Mine is at least adequate, and I also do calligraphy. Furthermore, you can work with someone on shoulder girdle strength from here to the day of doom, but if you are either not teaching handwriting or you are teaching handwriting in a way which is less than optimal, and we can discuss.
I'm glad you said it, because I would get people that went for a full year for shoulder girdle strength occupational therapy, and like, you know, that's a long time.
The skiing analogy again, if you have a lot of exercises to develop a young skier and you're putting him through, you know, push-ups and chin-ups and, you know, running and everything else that he or she might need to develop the muscles needed for skiing, but you are either not sending him to any actual ski classes, or the ones that you're sending him to have some fundamental flaw in terms of the technique that is taught, or at least a technique that won't work for that person, you won't have a skier no matter how great his physique is.
And what are some other problems with handwriting that you have noticed, one or two?
Okay, I have worked with people who have come from other countries where the language, the alphabet is different. You mentioned this because of your own experience. I have worked with people who have had visual issues. One issue that I've worked with, and you'd be amazed that this still goes on, but it does, is that I've worked with people who naturally were intended to be left-handed, but who had been switched to being right-handers. This is prevalent in certain cultures.
That used to happen even in the States about 20, 30 years ago.
I have two sisters
who were forced to change to go against what their natural
Both my sisters, who are younger than I am, I'm in my 50s, are left-handed, and one of them, who is close to me in age, but she's younger, actually was subjected to efforts of this kind in nursery school. My parents did get it stopped, but they basically found out by accident because they were investigating why my sister was coming home from school very upset.
And what other besides left hand, right hand, what other reasons?
I would say one reason is often a teacher's inflexibility in terms of being able to admit that there can be some divergence in pen hold and paper position, and the result can still work. Some hand positions and some paper positions are really not good for anyone, but some people are not well served from by the standard positioning. They may need a little bit of variation. I have a saying, everybody is different because every body is different.
Everybody's different. And what about if you have any experience with people who have ADHD and dysgraphia?
That's a big one, and by the way, I have had both of these, as well as some other conditions, as medical diagnoses for me. In fact, most of those diagnoses were made well after I'd improved my handwriting, and the neurologists were amazed because if you have what I have, you're not supposed to.
So you're saying you have ADHD?
I have been diagnosed with ADHD and with dysgraphia. The dysgraphia is certain. The ADHD, they're not sure if it's really that or if it's Asperger's syndrome, which I later was diagnosed with. But I also have probably what is known as dyspraxia, which is a general overall clumsiness that can really interfere with learning and retaining manual skills. I'm not the only one, by the way. I have known other people, some in quite famous positions in life.
Okay, and what about dysgraphia?
Dysgraphia, which is basically to writing what dyslexia is to reading, is basically a difficulty with what we can think of as motor planning, with assembling the different motor units of a pattern that's necessary for handwriting, meanwhile keeping in mind what you're trying to write and how you're making it come out. Let's just say that many of the bad handwriters of history, including the examples I've shown earlier, have signs which I am told by medical people are indicative of possible dysgraphia.
And we also have, we're going to show number 9, what this is all about.
Yes. What this is all about is some of the unfortunate difficulty which has come to be built into handwriting over recent centuries. If you look at what we have to do to get from some form of printing to a conventional cursive, difficult as it is. We know that most cursive letters in many forms of cursive, all cursive letters begin at the bottom. This is particularly so of the forms of cursive which are beloved by OTs. We know that this is often taught after printing letters which normally start at the top. And the problem that this causes is, take the word brown here. If you have a letter that ends anywhere above the bottom line, namely cursive B, cursive O, cursive W, and of course cursive B. 3 of these are in the word brown, so I use this as an example. When someone who has a visual perception issue or a motor planning issue, such as dysgraphia, or a language issue, such as dyslexia, or really anything that makes his ability to handwrite below average. And remember, mathematically, 50% of everyone is below average. So we're talking about half the population. When they learn to write, they will be trying and struggling as they write in cursive to start all the letters from the bottom as they were taught, and it doesn't even work. Any cursive method that says, oh, this is easy because it all starts at the bottom, it's not easy because it doesn't all start at the bottom.
You brought up a good point about handwriting from the top or the bottom. Now, I noticed there are languages, not like English, for instance, Indian, or maybe what's it called, Hindu?
Hindi is one of the major languages in India.
They start at the top line as the leading line versus the bottom line. What do you, or maybe there are some other languages that do that. What do you have to say about that?
It works for them. The world is full of a diversity of language forms and written scripts, and they each have their advantages and disadvantages. Hindi, as you said, starts at the top, and it does connections through a line that starts at the top and hangs everything together. It works for them. If you look at Hebrew, going right to left, one of the reasons that in Hebrew cursive nothing joins is that it would be horrendously difficult to make a join from the bottom of one letter to the top for a right-handed person going right to left, which is why you don't have joins in Hebrew cursive at all. It's simply a different letter set.
That's a good, so now I have a good question. It just came to my mind right now. If I was to start a language all over, a handwriting all over in a language, would actually, are there advantages of Hebrew going from right to left to English going from left to right, or is one better than the other, or then really each one has advantages
and disadvantages? It's a bit of a trade-off.
Like, what are the trade-offs?
Okay, for instance, for the right-handed majority, they might be inclined to start at the right because that's where their writing hand is. However, by the end of the line, they might be fatigued. There is some evidence from brain research that for the process of reading, for most normally organized right-handed people whose left hemisphere is dominant for language, that it works a little better if they are actually going from left to right. And that's the majority.
Reading.
Yes.
And that's very interesting because it's very interesting you mentioned that, because when handwriting came out, there wasn't really that much to read. There was probably more handwriting than there was reading, than there were text. The printing text wasn't created yet, so probably the ability to read a lot was not important.
It was important if you were in certain kinds of work. For instance, if you were
a scribe.
Yeah, you were a scribe. If you were in the clergy, you know, maybe eventually in the government or in some, you know, in some fields.
You're still not reading a lot.
In other words, you did not really read a lot. There was not the demand simply because it was hard to get books. And this probably created a great difference in instruction, because back before there were any printed texts on handwriting, if you think of, you know, a medieval monk teaching, you know, the new recruits.
But I'm talking about the time of ancient times.
Exactly. If you think of ancient times,
so then
the average person.
Might have been an advantage for writing from right to left.
There might have been in some
right.
cultures, although even some ancient cultures did go from left to right. But remember, we're dealing with a different population. People might have been much older when they began to learn to read.
Well, when we look at hieroglyphics, for instance, which was a pictograph type writing, that went all directions, left, right, up, down.
Because, well, if it's a picture, obviously, you know, a duck is a duck whether you start looking at it from the left side or the right side or the top or the bottom.
Yeah, but you could have made the whole phrase from the left or
Unlike,
the right.
But if you look at English, you know, or something like that, a lowercase b, you know, if you look at it from the wrong end too, you're going to get a D or you're going to get a Q or a P, as you as a dyslexia expert know quite well.
It's a good question.
Well,
So,
there's a
well,
lot. That would be a
I'm not
program.
That
would be a program in
More
itself.
than dyslexia.
Okay. Regardless, that would be an issue in itself. One thing I would say is that if we were starting a handwriting system from scratch, if we got to have your own planet and start your own handwriting, we would be best advised to have simple strokes, mainly starting at the top, having relatively few curves as far as they could be avoided. We would want some curvature.
Would that be similar to italic? Or?
Yes, it would be entirely similar to italic, which is actually the technical name of the first ever handwriting that I showed you way back when. In other words, that italic is actually at the root of the family tree of all the existing different later styles all over the world, wherever our alphabet is used. French cursive and Spanish cursive and Italian cursive today look so different from one another that if you learned French in America and you go and you write something in French in your best cursive in French, they have a hard time reading it, and you have a hard time reading theirs. But we can all read italic because that is the most recent common ancestor. It's the great grandpappy of all the complications that we added in later.
Interesting. Now, you know that I put out this video about handwriting because I had my own poor handwriting, but also I became an art instructor and I worked with kids who have ADHD, so I worked on relaxed concentration techniques, and I was a biofeedback therapist, so I worked with stress reduction, and I also am a videographer, so I put it all together into this video to help other people, just from the experience I had. Anyone can improve their own handwriting, and you had the opportunity, an expert like you, to see this video. What was your impression, and was there anything new in there, even though this video was the very first video on handwriting instruction, but was there anything new in that?
Well, first I was impressed with you as a videographer in terms of how interesting and lively you made it. Educational videos can often be deadly dull. Secondly, I was interested in the very practical balance between techniques that have been known for a while and are really used in a variety of methods and approaches and have a lot of time-tested, solid success behind them, and some of the new things you brought in. I liked to see the fact that Chinese exercise balls were being used as a hand relaxation and strengthening method, for instance. I was very taken by the use of visual relaxation methods such as looking at a sand glass or a water clock. I've done a variety of things to help students to relax.
Liquid timer, they're called.
Yeah.
That would be like relaxed concentration.
Yeah, I've done a lot of things to help students to relax, and I'll probably add that to my repertoire of things to do. I was very impressed by, you know, the very clear way that you laid out the instructions. I would say what else impressed me very much was I liked your emphasis on being alert to the sensory aspects of handwriting. For instance, the fountain pen, scratching on the paper and listening to that. I saw a lot that I like. I will tell you that I would probably have enjoyed seeing more emphasis on how certain forms of handwriting make it easier to relax than others. But who knows, the day is young and there may be more video coming out.
Do part 3, we'll do one together.
Why not? I would jump at the chance, by the way.
You brought up a good point about the relaxation or the relaxed concentration techniques and the sensory, because I put out the very first book, which became a video, for a self-help book for ADHD kids that was in color. It was called Being in Control, which I made into a movie called Being in Control, Natural Solutions for ADHD, Dyslexia, and ADHD, dyslexia, and test anxiety, because I am a tutor and I work with these kids. But why am I mentioning that? Because in the book, and at that time, there was the whole issue of relaxation with the senses and sensory integration as helping these kids instead of medications. And so I took from that idea of the sensory integration and I put it into usage as part of the video with improving the handwriting. So I'm very happy you picked up on that sensory part, because that was actually planned and part of the thinking of the time of sensory integration in helping people who have ADHD or dysgraphia or dyslexia.
Yeah, we need to attend a lot more to the sensory considerations. For instance, if you look at the average handwriting paper that gets doled out to kids, it's horrendous stuff to write on. It's basically wood pulp with shavings. The lines are very faint. You might have grayish-blue lines on grayish-beige paper. It's horrendously difficult to see, let alone to write on. One of the things that I've worked on and that has been out for years from a firm in another state is actually a package of handwriting practice papers that are designed to be very visual and tactile. I don't want to give product names, but I can leave you a link afterwards.
That's a good idea.
And this, in other words, we have white.
That's interesting. So we're, again, and we're going to end in a couple minutes.
And I will leave a source for you.
No, tell everybody, I know we have it on the paper, but tell everybody how they can get in contact with you and your web page.
My website is handwritingthatworks.com, and my contact information is right at the top of the first page. You've got my phone number, and you've got my address, and you've got my email.
So that's handwritingworks.com.
Thatworks.com. Handwritingthatworks.com. I will tell you, I get thousands of emails a day.
Wow.
Literally. So if you want to cut to the front of the line, the way to do it is to telephone me. Even when I travel, I do check that phone number at least once or twice every week when I'm on the road, so don't worry that you'll miss me.
Wow, that's amazing. Thousands of
literally, and that's after I filter out all the spam.
That's amazing. So, Kate, is there any last thing you'd like to mention before we close the show?
Yes, I'd like to say that handwriting should be a ladder, but too often we have made it into a cage.
And what does that mean?
What I mean is that handwriting should be a means whereby we can fulfill ourselves and we can progress, but too often we have made it into a technique of limiting people's development in literacy and other areas rather than helping them to advance.
So that actually fits in with my philosophy of a guy named Carl Rogers, which he was a proponent of self-actualization.
Yes.
And actually that's exactly what I do in all my videos that I put out, and in every single one of my video, which is, you can call it self-help, but it's actually more than self-help, it's self-actualization. So I'm very happy you mentioned that as your motto also. Well, Kate, it was a pleasure having you on Meet the Author.
The same here, and I look forward to a future appearance or appearances.
Thank you.
Thank you.